I want to talk a little bit about something called FPIES, F-P-I-E-S, because when we think about the gluten-free diet, most people think about this term, celiac. There's another term you got to be aware of, FPIES. What does that stand for? Food, protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome. So this is a problem that occurs, and it's most commonly in infants, and it occurs as a result of a similar type of reaction. It's not the classic allergy response. You know, when you take your loved one, or you take a child to the allergist and they do the skin prick tests and they're looking for allergic reactions. Well, those allergic reactions are mediated by something called IgE. This is a type of antibody that we produce in response to a food or a protein that we might get something like our lips swell or our throat constricts, or we might break out in hives. That's called an acute allergy. FPIES is not IgE related. FPIES looks a lot like celiac reaction, meaning it's a completely different type of immune system response, and the number one food that triggers this, and this can be identical to celiac disease, which is why I bring it up. You see these symptoms here. These are all symptoms of food protein-induced enterocolitis. Vomiting, diarrhea, weight loss, failure to thrive. This is true of infants and children. Lethargy and poor energy. So these are symptoms, generally speaking. Not only can it happen to children, it can happen to older folks as well, but it's very common to catch it earlier in childhood. And again, it matches celiac. And a lot of times what happens is a child will get a diagnosis of celiac, but they won't dig deeper. The doctors won't dig any deeper. The number one cause of food protein-induced enterocolitis is rice. And this has been studied several times, and this is actually one of the reasons why we see children have both. They have both food protein-induced enterocolitis, and they also have celiac disease, so they have both problems going on simultaneously. Remember, there's this old saying in medicine, and that is everybody's entitled to more than one problem, and sometimes you can have both. Sometimes you can have one and or the other. But rice was the number one trigger. And a lot of foods, a lot of not what we would call non-allergenic foods, what do they want to use? They want to use rice. Well, this is allergy. Remember I said earlier, this IgE is allergy, but this is different than allergy, right? So although rice may be low allergenic in terms of stimulating an IgE response, it is highest on the list of generating another type of immune response that looks exactly like celiac disease and can create the symptoms that match celiac disease. Again, that's called food protein-induced enterocolitis. You should be aware of it because it's very, very common. I see this on a relatively frequent basis, and it's just one of those other issues where rice is a problem. Now, let's talk a little bit more about cross-contamination. I mentioned earlier a little bit about it, but I want to share a quote with you from this recent food safety review. This was a major review published in the journal Nutrients here just several months ago. You can see here, again, new science, right? Not using antiquated science, but due to gluten contamination, many inherently gluten-free products derived from corn, rice, millet, etc. cannot be consumed by patients with celiac disease. These products, if misbranded as gluten-free and used by the patients with celiac disease, could result in a recurrence of symptoms. Contamination of gluten-free foods with gluten-containing material can occur at many stages of food production, from the fields to the farms to the mills to the factories, as well as handcraft enterprises, restaurants, and households. So again, a lot of these products that are being used, we know cross-contamination is a major issue. So even if you just completely ignored everything I just said about rice gluten and the fact that rice does contain a form of gluten and that gluten can induce an enterocolitis syndrome, if you ignored everything I just said, you should be hearing me right here, is that these foods, corn, rice, millet, etc., are cross-contaminated to such a great degree that celiac patients and gluten-sensitive individuals are not recovering. Now, from this review, these two statistics come from. Okay, so one of the studies reviewed in this major review showed that up to 32% of the time restaurant foods labeled gluten-free tested positive for gluten. Meaning these foods were taken, they were tested for gluten. Even though they were called gluten-free, they tested positive for gluten. We also have this, 20% of packaged products labeled gluten-free in one of these major studies tested positive for gluten. Now those are huge odds. That means if you are relying on eating out at restaurants, if you are relying on packaged processed foods as staples in your diet, you're playing Russian roulette with your recovery. And so I don't encourage that. And again, what did I say earlier? Up to 92% of gluten-sensitive individuals that go on the diet fail to achieve a remission or recovery of the intestinal damage. And what does that do? If your guts, if your intestines don't heal, what that does is that sets you up for malnutrition. And the problem with malnutrition is vitamin and mineral deficiencies, right? You need vitamins and minerals to heal and repair, right? So if you have malnutrition and you propagate that very same malnutrition by eating poorly, you never give your body the tools that it needs to heal and repair the damage, the years, depending on the case and when you were diagnosed, but the years of gluten-induced damage. And this can take, remember, to heal from a gluten-related issue can take 18 months and up to 3 years. So if you're doing this, right, you're sabotaging yourself, you're just fast-forwarding the nutritional, malnutrition, nutritional deficiency issue, and you're sabotaging your ability ever to recover. Let's look at some of the common foods that are rice-based that were found to be cross-contaminated with wheat, barley, and rye. Okay, so a lot of your breakfast cereals. As a matter of fact, here, very recently, there have been a number of cereal recalls. General Mills has had cereal recalls. Some of the gluten-free cereal brands have had a number of recalls. Why? Because somebody goofed, right? They put the wrong stuff in the product. It was cross-contaminated. A lot of your breads, a lot of your pastas, and a lot of these pastas, by the way, are garbage anyway. One of the other problems is almost none of this stuff, right? Your baby food, your meal replacement bars, most of this stuff is not even organic. And so part of the problem, it's not organic, then you get pesticide exposure. And one of the big issues, going on a gluten-free diet with pesticides is you're trying to recover your microbiome. That is, you're trying to recover the good, healthy bacteria that populate your GI tract, that help you digest your food, that help make B vitamins, that help your immune system calm down. And if you're eating a bunch of non-organic rice-based foods, what you're really doing is blowing out your gut with tons of pesticides, and you're disrupting your microbiome's ability to ever make a recovery. There have also been a number of recalls on baby food for other reasons, even beyond the gluten contamination. But we get recalls very frequently here for heavy metal, for toxic metals. How many of you, as parents, want to give your child extra cadmium or extra mercury or extra lead? Hopefully nobody's hands go up there, right? So these baby food, you have to understand, most of these baby food manufacturers don't care about your kid. They're making a very cheap, very junky, very malnourishing product at very low cost, and they're selling it back to you at an extreme markup. Most cases of formula and baby food are extremely expensive, even though the ingredients that goes into them are extremely toxic and extremely cheap to produce. And so it's very important if you're buying, you're a parent, you're buying things like baby food or formula because for whatever reason you might not be able to breastfeed, you need to read the ingredients, because the vast majority of the ingredients in those products is sugar and rice. Now, as I said earlier, other problems with rice, we said heavy metal toxicity. So rice has been shown, been a number of studies that have proven this, to be contaminated with arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead, right? And so if we're talking about infant cereals, if we're talking about infant food, right, what do these things do? They damage the skeletal structure, they damage the brain, they're very toxic, in that regard. And so they can create lower IQ, lower intelligence in your children, among other health issues. So these heavy metals are a major, major problem in brands of rice. And some people say, well, Dr. Osborne, what about brown rice? Brown rice is even worse because a lot of the heavy metals, where do they accumulate? Well, they accumulate in the bran. And so if you're taking that whole rice, right, the brown rice where you don't crack off that outer hull, you're getting most of the metals in that. It's actually polished rice actually has less metal than brown rice does. But the problem with the polished rice, it may have less metal, but it has also less vitamins and minerals, right? So it has less nutrition. So then what you get is you get this food that's super high in simple carbohydrates, right? So what is that? It's basically it's sugar. So now, whether you did brown rice, you got heavy metal. You go with white rice, it still has heavy metal, but you get less of it. But now you get this, right? You get all that sugar with low in nutrition density. And so then what does that do? There are a number of research studies showing that consumers of high levels of rice have a higher risk of development of type 2 diabetes. And some people come to me and say, well, what about China? What about India? Go look at them. They're overweight, they're obese, they have massive heart disease, they have massive stroke issues, and they have massive, massive levels of diabetics in those countries. Don't be fooled by the rhetoric that you might see on TV or that you might see in the commercials. Those countries struggle greatly with problems associated with using rice as a primary staple food in their diets. And so this last slide I've got for you is just something to be said. This was recently published in the journal Epidemiology. It talks about the unintended consequences of a gluten-free diet. Now, I would argue that when you're eating rice, you're not really on a gluten-free diet, but again, the traditional gluten-free diet, the unintended consequences. Commercial gluten-free products primarily contain rice flour as a substitute. Emerging evidence suggests rice-based products can contain high levels of toxic metals. Rice is a recognized source of arsenic and methyl mercury exposure. Again, the unintended consequences of people going gluten-free because they think it's a healthier diet. And so now what they're really doing is they're eating a bunch of rice-based processed junk foods full of pesticides and heavy metals. And so the unintended consequences they're damaging their health in an attempt to try to achieve greater levels of health. So remember, just because something is labeled gluten-free doesn't necessarily give it this kind of automatic stamp of being a healthy product. And rice is definitely one of those. Not only is it not gluten-free because of the orzonin that it contains, but again, the other problems associated with it, as we've discussed tonight, are a big, big issue and a big, real problem as to why many people trying to go on a gluten-free diet never truly, really recover and continue to have years and years of persistent problems, inflammation, and progression of disease. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.